everybody. My name is Martin Davis. I'm the Managing Director for Emerging Markets in Africa at Deloitte. And welcome to our conversation today entitled Energy for Transport Connecting the Markets. Before I introduce our esteemed, thank you for joining us, our esteemed panelists, just to introduce the topic. I think that for me, it's Africa, not just our region, but globally, we're having to adapt to a very rapid technological shift that's underway in the energy, and the automotive, and the transportation space. And we can call this a power shift moment. I recently saw a picture which reminds me almost of the present, where it was in New York City in 1900. And it showed a picture of a very busy street in what looks like Manhattan. And the street was full of horses and carts. And the exact same location, the picture was taken in 1913. And the 1900 picture, there was literally horses and carts and one internal combustion engine powered vehicle. In 1913, a picture was taken in exactly the same location, and the street was just as busy, but there were no more horses and carts. I think there was one, but it was all internal combustion cars. And that was a significant moment, almost a decade of what we could say power shift, going back a century or more. And I think we're on the cusp of something similar here now globally. And the question is how will this new power revolution, which may be not so much a force for industrialization, potentially deindustrialization, but how will it impact certainly our continent? The first revolution, of course, was steam power and mechanization. The second revolution was around electricity-powered mass production. The third will be driven, where we are now, by battery technology and arguably sort of micro power. And how does this impact the transportation sector across our continent? And perhaps, I think, looking forward, and this is the intention of this conversation today, is this power shift, of course, will have profound implications for all industries across our continent. How do companies, how do industries, how do countries even start to think about this to embrace the current for future development? From my side, thank you. I'd like the structure of the next hour's conversation is that I will very briefly introduce the speakers, and they will give their opinions, initial opinions on the topic, will integrate the conversation, and hopefully come to some sort of views as to what the future holds and how the African countries and companies start to understand this power shift. And what does it really mean, this linkage between new energy and transportation across the continent, enabling industries, creating markets or linking markets, if you will, and impacting on the lives of ordinary Africans in a positive way, hopefully. If I can initially invite each one of our panelists just to say some introductory words, perhaps, and their high-level views on the topic. Shante Blumen is the founder and managing director of Mobility for Africa. Shante, you're first. Your views, please.
Thanks very much for having me. I know we're at an energy indaba, but I always like to remind people that in this continent, as well as a huge deficit in energy generation, we have a transport and mobility crisis. If we look at both urban and rural Africa, the cost and the time that most people spend on accessing transport, especially women, is ridiculous. I think you set the scene with painting a picture of 100 years ago in New York. I think we should be much more ambitious in this continent and be looking to see the opportunity that electric mobility can give to addressing the transport crisis. And I've been working in this sector now for the last 3 years, testing models for rural mobility. I don't think we should just focus on urban. I think we should remember that 70% of this continent is still agriculture. Agriculture is the largest employer in the continent. It's so many aspects of local economy is dependent on food security and agricultural production. So we've been testing last mile solutions using off-grid energy and a battery swapping system. We've been investing in battery technology. And as you point out, we have sort of no excuse at the moment. We have the huge drop in the cost of renewable energy. We have the cost and new technology being invested in battery technology. And we have the digital revolution to underpin it. We have means to collect financing and de-risk rural populations to make this viable. And I think, just in conclusion, one of the challenges is to shift people's mindset to see the huge potential and to think long term and to think big. We have a short window to go to carbon neutral, but we shouldn't forget that people that haven't caused the emissions crisis shouldn't be held back and continue to deal with the brunt of it, but also continue not to have access to markets and increase productivity and all the economic consequences that go with the lack of rural transport.
Shanta, thank you very much. Can I invite Idris? Idris Rufai is the CEO of well-named, I must say, Hamster Energy. Idris is based in Lagos, Nigeria. Idris, just offline, before we started, we were talking, you briefly mentioned the telecommunications revolution that Africa has certainly experienced and measured or certainly observed through the rapid rise in the last generation of mobile technology. What about the next revolution, as Shanta alludes to, the energy revolution? What are your thoughts from Lagos? Idris, I don't want to direct your opening remarks too much, but please fire away.
Yes, first of all, we have to think about, the state of our energy system in Africa first, before we can think of e-mobility, because in Africa, we do not have the energy system that supports electric mobility. We need to get that right a bit, to try and talk about the evolution of the electricity grid. We started from a conventional grid, which was invented by Thomas Edison and Nikola Tesla, the AC/DC era. And this became a state-owned system where electricity was just for, providing power to the people, mass production of power, whereby people get electricity. So because of poor economic performance of the system, and poor services to the people, we had to migrate to a kind of energy, the grid system I call grid 1.0, which is a dismantled grid now, not a state-owned grid, state-owned grid, vertically integrated, conventional grid. They have to dismantle the grid and to make sure competition comes in so that, the market electricity can be more affordable and the service can be better. So we operated this same system from then to when we had to decarbonize. We had to decarbonize because most of the power plants used for generation in that system were mainly fossil fuels. So we had to decarbonize, and through decarbonization, we had to shift to grid 2.0. The grid 2.0 now had to do with a decentralized grid, which brings about interaction of renewables with the normal grid 1.0 in order to reduce carbon emission from the grid. So right now, we in the grid 2.0, electric mobility can easily be integrated because of flexibility of the grid again. I forgot to mention that in grid 1.0. Grid 1.0 wasn't flexible. It's just a one-way system that provides electricity to consumers. So grid 2.0 had to be more flexible because renewable energy from different generators had to go into the grid and come and supply power. So it was like a back and forth interaction. So that currently is the system that supports electric mobility, because if you look at the way electric mobility has been deployed in other continents now, it has this feature of vehicle to grid, whereby we can sell back some of your charge to the grid in order to help balance the grid or maybe shave peak electricity from the grid. So we don't have that kind of system in Africa. So we need to think hard, and we go from this to a kind of energy system. We don't have a functional grid yet. Most of the countries have a functional grid in Africa. How do we go from this, from maybe most of us are still struggling with grid 1.0, transitioning to grid 1.0. We've not found our feet yet, How can we go from this very grid 1.0 and leapfrog grid 2.0, and maybe we may end up in something I call grid 3.0, whereby we don't need a grid, we don't need to integrate most of these things. We can build a decentralized system, where electric vehicle will play an enabling role, unlike grid 1.0, where the grid plays an enabling role in the system. Electric vehicle plays an enabling role in this system where different people with decentralized system can have a system where they can charge their car and maybe interact with other participants. There are a lot of participants, small scale investment, small scale investment now, instead of big, large scale, small investors with big power plants. Now we have large investors with small decentralized system to make this work. So we've been thinking very hard on how to make Grid 3.0 work. And part of the solutions we are looking at is probably we have Grid 3.0, electric vehicle, solar panel, battery, AI, and blockchain technology. So I feel with this, e-mobility can start to work, and which is why I compared it to telecommunication revolution, where we had to leapfrog building of all these centralized masts, to just everybody having.
Got it. Thanks. Just very briefly, I'm just super curious. What does Hamster Energy do?
Yeah, Hamster Energy is we are building the largest electric vehicle charging network in Africa, which is to provide charging solutions, and then also that will connect people, different people, participants, people with decentralized system that will connect them, and this will be enabled with electric vehicle. So we are looking at how to make electric vehicle solution, electric vehicle work first. When electric vehicle works, then we'll increase the amount of distributed energy solution like solar, especially home systems.
Okay,
so that's what we're trying to.
Thanks, just for your opening remarks. Appreciate it. Thank you. Can I come to Thomas? Thomas Hillig is in Munich today. Thomas is the managing director of, have I got this right, Thomas? Zenergy?
TH Energy. I don't mind to say the energy, but it is Thomas Hillig Energy.
Fantastic.
TH Energy.
Thomas, your view, power shifter, described it earlier. Tell us firstly, what does your company do? What is your sort of ambition? And what are your views on the topic?
Yeah. So TH Energy is a boutique consultancy. I founded it 8 years ago. Our initial topic was only microgrids for remote mines. So not too much link actually to the transport sector. Over the years, we have also been consulting large oil and gas companies. We did due diligences, for example, in Kenya, when one of the European players wanted to buy a rural electrification company. We have helped other players to get into the sustainability markets in general. So this very specific focus was in the beginning, and still it is our cash cow, I have to admit. Lately, or I have another hat, due to COVID, traveling over here in Europe was not so much possible. And some of the big players like Siemens and Schneider Electric, they found out that I have quite some social media followers, and I turned into something which in other industries wouldn't be possible. So I became social media influencer. I still struggle to say that. But part of what TH Energy does is actually social media work around, at the moment, mainly Europe. This is the second aspect. And sometimes there is this link between the two things. For example, I was at a local Siemens headquarter recently, and investigating with their experts about a microgrid that powered this particular headquarter. I was very surprised to learn that the driver for the microgrid was actually e-mobility, because they wanted to offer charging opportunities for their visitors, for the employees. And in order to manage the capacity charge, in order to avoid a bigger grid connection, the solution was to take part of the system actually off the grid. They're still grid connected there. It's, by the way, not in Africa, but I think this is something we could also see in Africa. With my social media hat, I'm also pretty active in testing e-cars, so some of the fun things. Mining is not, okay, it's nice, but not so much fun for everyone who has to be in mine. So it's something very convenient. I will be at the end of the week in Hamburg to test drive some Volvo cars. I've tested in remote areas in Europe, various e-cars, and also, by the way, hydrogen cars. I have a big LinkedIn group about hydrogen, 20,000 members, and this also opens some doors for hydrogen consulting and also for testing hydrogen cars. I'm very fascinated to compare actually remote electrification in villages. We already heard before, there is some aspect of leapfrogging. I also have a look from a different perspective. Doing local microgrids in remote areas actually decreases the system aspect. So you kind of build with the microgrid an isolated, or to some extent isolated structure in this remote area. In e-mobility, I think this shift changes because the electric car, for most of the drives that we actually do, it has to be urban, but then for many users, it also has to go to rural areas. And it will be only fully competitive if we have this full system approach. So charging in remote areas, charging in urban areas. If not, of course, there are certain applications where, for example, a company has a headquarter and a subsidiary and is willing to buy an e-car that goes mainly from the headquarter to the subsidiary and back. This is an easy approach. But to have the full application for electric cars, actually, it has to compete with internal combustion engines and also cover all different kind of drives that are involved. And a last aspect I want to mention is about the fleet. I think we have a very dynamic aspect. If you shut down a coal-fired power plant, it won't be built somewhere else. It is shut down, it won't exist anymore. If we get e-cars on the street, there is, of course, for this particular owner, he won't have his internal combustion engine car anymore, but the car won't disappear. So it shows up somewhere else. And maybe if we have a look at the typical car use, there is also a link to Africa, which makes the situation a little bit different if we compare how the situation is, for example, in Europe and in comparison how it will be in Africa. This dynamic approach, what happens actually with individual vehicles over the life cycle.
Thomas, thank you. By the way, I'm actually following you now. I just looked at your social media page here, and 53,000 followers at TH Energy Net. That's you on Twitter.
Yep.
Thanks, Thomas.
For the advertising, for the promotion.
That's all good. Dr. Remadzai Kuhudzai, who's based in Harare in Zimbabwe. Remadzai, you're founder of Electric Drive Africa, very ambitiously named. Shanta used the word ambitious earlier. Your company's name is very ambitious. What are your views in building upon what Thomas particularly said about
thank you.
Electric future, possible electric future of Africa?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Yes, very ambitious because we want to see Africa electrify. As has been discussed earlier, electrification presents an opportunity to leapfrog. But I think because if you look at Africa in general, the transport sector is not very inclusive, as Shanta mentioned earlier. A lot of areas, the majority of areas are underserved. There are this data that talks about, let's split the sectors first before fleets. Let's talk about personal vehicles. If you look at San Marino or somewhere like America, the USA, in San Marino, they have more cars per 1,000 people. So they have more than 1,000 cars per 1,000 people in the population. In America, that number is about 800 cars per 1,000 people. In Africa, it's mostly below 200, South Africa. The rest of the continent is mostly below 50 per 1,000 people. So it's not very inclusive, but it's also because of most of the infrastructure in terms of the rural urban landscape. It has been quite difficult to increase the penetration because of the access roads, access to energy, and also the economic level in terms of people being able to afford certain energy costs and transport costs. So the transition presents a new era where we can sort of democratize the transport sector in two ways, by making it inclusive and also by re-looking at how we think of the energy transport relationship. Currently, you would have automakers, their job was just to focus on making cars. And then you would have the oil companies, whose job was to focus on producing the oil that gets into the cars. But now we have to look at it inclusively, whereby the automaker is not just making a car, but also has to consider the energy use of that car and also where the energy comes from. Before, if an automaker is making a car, they just hope someone buys it, and someone drives 2 kilometers, he finds a petrol station, he fills up his car, he goes on his way. And also because of lack of infrastructure and access, the fuel players did not have an incentive to open petrol stations in rural areas. So it's pretty hard in the rural areas, in the farms, to get access to petrol and diesel. It's very expensive to get it there. But because now we're using new energy, be it distributed cases in terms of renewables like solar, it would actually be easier to then look at it holistically. And if people who are looking at 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers bringing energy transport to rural areas can just tie to a rural microgrid and charge those vehicles, and those vehicles provide access to transport for critical care like hospitals and clinic visits, and also transporting goods to the market from the farms, therefore dealing with the enormous amount of post-harvest losses we experience on the continent. So thinking of it holistically, that's how this opportunity is presented in the modern world. And also, if you look at the Africa, I think it is mentioned, the grid infrastructure is not so solid in most parts of the continent, but it also presents a chance to look at how the energy system works in overall and where we get our energy from. So I think there are two contrasting areas I want to focus on now. If you're in South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia, currently you'll be accustomed to what they call load shedding, because the utility companies are not able to meet demand due to aging coal plants and aging infrastructure. Therefore, they have to ration power for a certain amount of hours during the day. But then you have, on the flip side, you have countries like Rwanda, like Uganda, Kenya, and Ghana, where they actually have an excess of generation capacity, dependable generation capacity. Like, for example, in Kenya, their generation capacity is 2,800 megawatts, but their peak is not even 1,900 megawatts. So during the evenings, they even have an excess of over 1,500 megawatt hours of capacity. So Ghana even has an excess of 2,000 megawatts. And unfortunately, in Ghana's case, they have what they call take-or-pay clauses, whereby a couple of years ago, they had a massive energy shortage. So then they invited all these IPPs to build capacity, and they had so much deficit, they had to put in these take-or-pay clauses. But now, when they ramped up generation, they have so much capacity, and they still have to pay for that capacity, even if they don't take any of the energy. So Ghana is now trying to bring up what they call the Drive Electric Initiative to try and encourage people to switch to electric, to try and absorb some of this excess energy. So there's also that factor whereby we have to evaluate each country's circumstance in terms of the energy scenario. What is the best way forward in terms of utilizing that energy, bearing in mind the transport patterns in those areas and also the resources in those local economies. I want to give another example of Kenya as well. Kenya's largest single energy generator is the 300 megawatt wind project in Lake Turkana. But that is a variable renewable energy resource. And they have a lot of baseload geothermal energy in Kenya. And some of that time, because of some of the clauses between the generators and the off-takers, they have to take up that wind and vent some of that geothermal. But now, all the energy systems and how they interact, what can we do with this excess geothermal at times? Do we then now try and produce green hydrogen to power the large fleet vehicles, let's say the railways and the trucks and the shipping industry and things like that? So I think there's need to look at how the ecosystem is in each of these countries and how to make use and optimize the available resources.
Ramaz, thank you. If I can just pose a question to you then, and I'll go back to what Idris said earlier. He spoke about sort of grid 1.0, which is sort of the mass grid, if you will, typically state-owned enterprise, power generated, dirty sort of power, think coal and the like. And that clearly is inadequate for Africa's emerging power needs. Clearly, the countries you mentioned Ghana, you mentioned Kenya. So much of this, what you've said is all very well, but so much of this is clearly dependent on policy, i.e. liberalization, arguably privatization, to enable grid 2.0 or micro energy sort of provisions, especially for what Shanta mentioned, Thomas mentioned, for more rural areas. Are African states, beyond the ones you mentioned, sufficiently thinking about energy policy to enable this transportation ecosystem or power, the emerging power ecosystem that you describe?
I think at this moment they need to step it up. I think they're not acting fast enough to accommodate the needs of Grid 3.0 according to Idris. For example, he talked about how flexible the grid should be and how we need to look at how now we're getting bidirectionality, and also the central energy players could benefit from the new evolution, because they have this extensive transmission network that they can optimize and use in this ecosystem. For example, to accelerate the penetration of new energy systems, and also to increase generation capacity where we have deficits. For example, in South Africa, they've just, I think they've now approved a 100 megawatt limit in terms of what independent producers can produce without having to go through the strenuous permitting and licensing processes. And for example, you might have a big data center in Cape Town without space, but they have their own means and funds to offtake. Maybe, let's say, if we build a 200 megawatt PV plant in Mpumalanga, where some of the coal plants are being switched off and some of the coal mines have now been decommissioned, and then we can wheel that energy to the data. Yeah,
entirely correct. But then, Shanta, coming to yourself, isn't this incredibly disruptive for vested interests of utilities that are typically state-owned? And I'm seeing, you mentioned South Africa's case, Ramazai. Yes, liberalization is very welcome, but it's come with a significantly overdue, as you allude to, and much political and commercial battles in the process. Shanta, how do we balance this? I mean, I just fear that we will be missing this, as Ramazai alludes to, this energy revolution, if we don't recognize and liberalize accordingly. Your views?
Well, so I think first we have to acknowledge there has been a dramatic global shift in this conversation. So usually we're in silos. The transport sector doesn't speak to the energy sector, and that happens in governments as well. You know what I mean? You have different vested interests within the Ministry of Finance versus the Ministry of Energy versus the Ministry of Transport. So we need to build an ecosystem that brings these different actors together to create the incentives for the right investment to make the shift. Some successful examples. Rwanda's already launched their, EV policy. A lot of countries are in the process. Rameza and I have been working in Zimbabwe on the policy. Ghana's got a policy in the making. Kenya. So I think as is globally the case, the world is waking up, and we saw that at COP. All of a sudden everyone is talking about targets for transport, which weren't on the table before. So that's one thing. It's not going to be easy because, as you said, we have different ministries with different vested interests, and we're going to need a level of visionary leadership. And that's, to me, what's going to be critical. We need to sort of knock heads and pull people in line and prove that the integration, we can't afford to be territorial, and we can't afford, to be regressive in terms of the policy landscape. I think what's interesting is what Ramedzai was pointing out with the energy generation conversation is obviously an enormous one. And obviously some deficits, some countries have excess, but we've also seen, for example, the challenges of mini grids in isolation. Their business model isn't viable in rural areas because it's based on energy for consumption. Energy for consumption is not what Africa needs at the moment. Energy for productivity. And now everyone's got the buzzword of productive use energy. I would say that mobility and transport is the enabler to building local economies, whether it's in urban or rural. Because if you look at what households spend, it's at least 20 to 30% of their income on transport. It can be even greater. Sometimes the incentive to get to work is not worth it, because your day wage is consumed by transport. The other global shift, which I think is very exciting for Africa, is shared mobility. We've got Uber now in various countries in the continent, but we can create new models of shared mobility. We've been testing in rural areas shared. We've set up a little mini transport system for rural women. We've got women sharing and then paying a monthly rental fee for transport. So I think that there's a level of creativity we need to think about, and I think we also need to start, I don't think it's neither or. I think we need independent energy producers. We need governments to take energy security seriously. And I think that is on the agenda. I think most governments realise energy security is an investment. How they reach and scale up is going to be critical. But the final point is, Ramedzai said it, mobility makes it viable. Mobility needs energy. It's a safe market. Petrol is one of the most expensive imported commodities in this continent, besides Nigeria. And, even Nigeria doesn't benefit from its oil or Angola. So to be frank with you, we need to get governments weaned off whatever the oil petrochemical business is, and start putting that subsidy and investment into renewables and viable transport systems. So it's priorities. At the moment, if we leave it to individual ministries, it won't happen. We need top-level leadership and vision. Otherwise, we're not going to be catalysing this moment.
Shanta, well said. And I want to pick up on financing. Idris, coming to you in Nigeria. So your day job, Idris, as you said, is to seek to install charging capacity, for increased e-mobility in around Lagos. We've seen the success and rapid ramping up of EVs, particularly in sort of West Coast US and China, in Western Europe. And this has been underwritten by state subsidies. Who's paying for charging infrastructure in Nigeria and the region? What are the financing models? Idris?
So we just started rolling out, we're completing our first charging station in Lagos now. And with this, we're a startup, still a startup. We just started last year. And so we're building our first charging station in Lagos now. So we are looking at a situation whereby we would partner with auto companies, because most of the brands they'll be selling very soon are going to be electric. Look at Hyundai, for example. They just announced that from 2022, all their new models will be electric. So we're looking at partnering with we partnered with Hyundai in Nigeria, in Lagos here. We're looking at partnering with more auto sellers, because these people need to, like Dr. Ramadzai said before, that they need to think about how to provide energy for this electric vehicle too. So one of the ways we want to do that is to partner with them, build charging stations together, And in the kind of the people who are buying this electric vehicle will have to subscribe as they have to subscribe to our network.
Idris, thank you. So coming to the key issue of financing here, what are your experiences in, Ramazai, looking at sort of the Southern Africa case here? We looked at, it just talks to his partnership with Hyundai on automotive, moving to mobility space in Nigeria. We know the case of VW in Rwanda. Clearly this is not state subsidized, but arguably investor or private sector subsidized, supported. Is this the best model going forward? But to what extent can we expect this balance between private financing and state financing? Ramazai, your views?
Yes, I believe so. And I've been working in the solar energy space, in the commercial industrial solar sector for about 10 years now. And I think this is the same approach that saw the solar energy sector grow in terms of the captive solar market. If you look at the USA, the big players like Solar City, they mostly grew through the American system, where you have lots of subsidies and rebates and incentives in the solar space, which we don't have in Africa. On the one side, you have governments who say, hey guys, we're cash strapped. We don't have any money to put in here. So we've been talking to policymakers around this in the EV space as well. And they're saying, guys, we don't have money to put in here. How can we work around this? Because all they see is if you bring electric vehicles, they get all their tax from petrol. So now if I have to reduce my revenue from the tax I'm charging on fuel, how am I going to make my money? How will I pay my teachers and my nurses? So if you look at South Africa last year, in the commercial industrial rooftop solar, they cumulatively, I think they installed about 1,000 megawatts of solar. And that's all self-funded from private sector, bringing in commercial PPAs, where a factory signs with a developer and they pay a tariff which is cheaper than their utility tariff for a period of 20 years. And then it makes business sense for that factory to then get into the solar business. The same thing will happen with mobility space. If the same companies that are adopting solar are the same large fleet operators. They can be factories, people running distribution centers and warehouses, or big mines. The same people putting solar in those mines and factories have big fleets. So they could start by installing charging stations at their own centers for their own fleets and electrify their fleets. I think that is the model that will roll out initially, and also the partnerships between the automakers and people like Idris. As you know, in South Africa, there are companies like Grid Cars who are already partnering with Jaguar, Audi, and BMW to partner and roll out. So I think the governments may not want to play and subsidize much because they're strapped for cash, but private partnerships are going to drive this. That's how it will be financed, just like in the solar space.
Private partnerships. Can I jump, Thomas, can I come to you? Is that, this is, Ramazai alluded to something very important, which we're seeing very soon coming over the horizon in Western Europe. The extent of state subsidies, the increasingly rapid adoption of electric vehicles poses a significant, I would argue, medium to long-term challenge for revenue authorities in countries. The receipts from taxation of fuel are significant, much less so. How does a state recoup funds from an electric vehicle fleet rather than one that's internal combustion engine when petrol stations are no longer selling fuel? This seems to be an issue which hasn't really been thought through, certainly not, I think, effectively strategized by governments going forward. How do you, if there is an adoption of electric vehicles en masse, be it commercial or passenger, and this is in the distant future, how do ministries of finance recoup those funds? Thomas?
Yeah, I think a very good question, actually. I think there is still this hope that costs will be driven down considerably if we get more and more cars on the street, and then that there is somehow a way of financing these tax losses. I personally also would put a question mark at that. Comparing business cases, of today, where you have all the subsidies, where you have all the tax on the one business model, and then where you have the subsidies on the other business model, and say, okay, from a commercial point of view, there is a break even, a little bit similar to solar. It might be the indirect fact of taxing CO2 losses to balance the system and say there is cost for internal combustion engines. When we were talking about rural electrification, by the way, I think it's very important to electrify rural areas. But as mentioned before, they are poor, and it's very difficult to have favorable business models. And in the end, I think there is no other way around, if you have a good story, to do something sustainable, to get funding by the international community. With rural electrification, I think international organizations are very favorable because they see actually that if they build somewhere a solar microgrid, they basically can solve all the problems. We've heard before, it's not that easy. It's more actually about productive use. But we talk about very challenging business models in the end. And if we want to actually make this happen, it is about finding a way to subsidize until costs come down. If they really come down, I'm not 100% convinced, I have to admit. And so I don't have an answer to your question, but more I have to admit that it is challenging, no doubt.
Thanks, Thomas. Shante, you want to jump in here?
Just to say, I've spent the last 3 years working on business models in rural areas and trying to convince investors that they should think differently. I'm all welcome to subsidies from the development institutions. I'd say at the moment, unfortunately, they are very risk adverse. So once they catch on something, then they tend to, that's got the tick of the box. E-mobility is a new space for them, and I'm hoping that the shift and the tipping point comes where they are willing to invest more. But I would just say,
is it a new story? Sorry to interrupt you. Is it a new story for the international investment community? Okay, they see it's very challenging to get.
But they don't want to experiment, Thomas. The risk aversion is piloting and experimenting. Africa won't change without R&D and investing in new technology and adapting it for Africa. And that's the problem. Most people want a formula that reads a business model before they've done any R&D. I don't know which part of the world does a big multinational spend money without research and development. But in this continent, we expect every business model to work without R&D. That's point one. But secondly, on rural farmers, let me tell you, here in Zimbabwe, we have extremely productive farmers. We have 200,000 farmers that are part of outgrower schemes. They sell cotton, they sell tobacco, they sell avocados, they sell dairy. We're setting up in a dairy community. Those dairy farmers we're working with who are going to lease to purchase a tricycle, they can make $10 a day selling milk. What's their biggest burden? Transport. Some of our customers are carrying it currently on a donkey. If they can produce more milk, one of our ladies is now last week produced 600 litres of milk with a Humber, right? Electric, no costs. She would otherwise have to have spent $14 a day on hiring a second-hand car to get the 14 kilometres. Now, East Africa has a lot of motorbikes. West Africa has motorbikes. Southern Africa doesn't have motorbikes. Motorbikes are great. The two-wheelers are great, but they don't carry huge amounts of stuff. So there's a lot of scope for trying and testing new models. And rural people, even in Zimbabwe, where everyone thinks we're really poor, let me tell you, people in rural areas have US dollars, and they are most probably more entrepreneurial than anyone I know. So I think we need to stop the perception that rural areas are too poor, and we need to start actually de-risking them and actually collecting real data about what their income potential is and what they grow, and solving the problem that they have, which is their crops rot because they can't get them to a growth point or to a market for a truck to take them to somewhere else. But in Southern Africa, we have outgrowing schemes. I mean, big multinationals are working with hundreds of thousands of farmers. This is Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Zambia. They're already de-risked. They sell their crops. We just need to think differently, and we need to be braver to test new models. Because I tell you what, I just think we can only expect importing stuff from China and India without testing it for so long, and then we expect the Europeans to design it. We've got to shift our thinking. Sorry, we need this to be a bolder experiment. We've got 10 years before God knows how, we can't wait. And so I think we've got to just start thinking, pair testing, throw money at research, but on the ground, in the communities, in rural areas, not in other capital cities or African capital cities. Get our hands dirty. Sorry, that's my frustration.
Shannon, well said. And as you say, can I say that bad infrastructure is highly inflationary, isn't it? And it's about access to markets through mobility and transportation. But Idris, coming back to you, I mean, Nigeria, I'm guessing, is probably the most, on a power per capita, or access to power per capita, Nigeria must be the poorest country in the world in terms of access to power per capita. What Shanta and Thomas are describing is something that here's an economy, and it applies to many West African economies that are addicted to oil, addicted to carbon, effectively. How is what is the thinking in these economies, using Nigeria as a case study? Are we seeing it at a national level, federal level, a state level, any progressive stories where economies can wean themselves off carbon to new energy thinking and ultimately new transportation systems, something which Nigeria really has not been good at in recent decades? Idris?
Yes, I believe so, and which is why we're working towards this, because it's we need to think differently on how we want to, we want to make our transition. You understand? Because most of the people are of the mindset that energy is a social resource in Nigeria, mostly because you still have to heavily subsidize petrol, even electricity. Just recently about to remove petrol subsidy in Nigeria, but because of political reasons, they had to shift it till next year after the election. So it's just a lot of people think energy is something that should be that is done by the government, done on the people. You understand? So in our own thinking, we think we need to help people reason that energy should be done by the people, not on the people, because it is not in this new energy transition, in the energy transition now, it is about, to decarbonize. If you have to decarbonize, you have to decentralize. And if you want to decentralize and get efficient use of the energy, you have to digitize too. And by digitization, you end up democratizing energy too, because people can freely trade energy with themselves. You understand? You need to, and when you digitize, that you've decoupled everyone from, depending on maybe the central, you decouple the central grid from individual household. You understand? Then we're also thinking of a situation whereby community themselves can invest in energy, decentralized energy system, where maybe individual or group of communities can invest in other community, maybe low-income community, and power their household, and also have electric vehicle charging points there where they can make money. And these people can pay, this household can also pay, like maybe because they are using their roof space, they can give them certain amount of energy to consume every day for free. You understand? But if they have to consume above that, they have to pay. But the main money, people charge their electric vehicle, maybe motorbikes or three-wheelers or electric cars. The main money will be made from people coming around to charge. So it's just like we have to change the way we think about energy now. It is with us now. We need to go with that mindset that we are the energy. It doesn't have to do with the government again. You just look at what is happening in here now. Hello? Can you hear me?
Yes, Idris, we have you.
So if you look at what is going on in the social network now, a lot of people don't have to depend on maybe the central social network to get their news anymore. I can't even remember the last time I listened to or I went online to watch CNN. I have my local bloggers here that feed us news. The people are now the information, you understand? We are now the network, you understand? So we need to think about that in energy too. That energy is now with the people. It should be done by the people, not on the people.
Just thank you. I think, we're near the end of our session. And before I invite each one of you to give some concluding thoughts and way forward, perhaps, for me, I think this whole energy revolution and impact on transportation systems ultimately is being driven, and we're seeing, as I mentioned earlier, countries like China, Western Europe, West Coast, particularly West Coast United States, amongst other countries, economies that are really driving this change. They're driven by a number of factors. It's, as we discussed, is policy, government regulation, first and foremost. But we seem to be, maybe with few exceptions, which were mentioned at the beginning, countries like Rwanda, Kenya, Ghana, perhaps, South Africa to an extent, is by government policy, enabling government policy rather than that's protecting vested interests, arguably. Secondly, is how do we price carbon? Is carbon being priced effectively in the countries and the economies in which we operate? And I think that's a crucial issue, and it's in the form of tax, particularly powering internal combustion engines, as we spoke about, fuel, petrol, diesel, typically. Thirdly, is what government, what state-provided incentive schemes are there in our region? Clearly, very few. We haven't got the fiscal headspace that many countries in Asia or Western Europe or the US have to subsidize this nascent industry that's rapidly changing, as discussed, of energy, of power shift, effectively. Charging infrastructure, Idris, this is your day job. How do we have a necessary charging infrastructure to enable new mobility across the continent? And even arguably an environmental consciousness. Do we across the continent, and Shanti spoke of this at the beginning of the conversation, do we have an environmental consciousness compared to other regions where there's a consumer imperative to drive change in energy policy? I think all these are crucial. So I think maybe a last question for myself, and I'll give each one of you 1 minute to conclude in terms of way forward, highlights of the conversation and way forward. My leading question is, well, how will this power shift, this change in energy systems impact transformation or transportation systems in African economies? We haven't even started to speak about regional economies, just particularly national economies. And what sort of fuel sources, solar, hydrogen was mentioned. What are the energy sources here how do we start to get the mix right that can really drive true change, energy change, transportation change, industrial change, ultimately, across our region? Can I first, Ramadzai, your concluding comments, please, in a minute, if I may ask you. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to emphasize that I think for us to see this happen, African countries need to look at themselves first individually. What is the best route for them based on the resources they have? What is viable for them? For example, South Africa is working on they're trying to develop what they call the hydrogen valley from Limpopo all the way to Durban, that hydrogen corridor with the other big players in this space, Sasol, Anglo, and all those players. So each country needs to look specifically, what resources do we have and how do we optimize them? Namibia is also working on a big hydrogen policy. And also, for example, if you look at Zimbabwe, for example, they have a lot of this minerals that are going into making the systems for vehicles. There's lithium, there's the graphite, there's some nickel, and all these resources. Same with Mozambique. Tesla actually gets graphite now from Mozambique. So in terms of the whole ecosystem, and how this will be transformed, it should also zone in on how each country can benefit from already the resources it have and how best is it to apply these resources. And that will determine maybe the energy mix that goes in there. Which countries have wind? Should we focus on that? Which countries have hydro? Factoring in all the variability now with the climate change and things like that. I think that is the best way forward for the countries to look at them and say, what can we use ourselves as a country? And then as a region, as SADC, what is the common thing we can work on together to drive this forward? And then
thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Ramazan. Got it. Thank you. Thomas, your concluding remarks and more importantly, perhaps way forward.
Yep. If we talk about rural electrification, I always see that there have to be cost advantages. And I think with the business cases that Shanta explained, it's very important that there are cost advantages, because there is a dirty solution and the clean solution, if we don't talk about getting subsidies on board, must have in the end cost advantages. I think there is one single segment where we don't have to see cost advantage, and this is about corporates. So Martin, if you as Deloitte want to consult the big global companies who are committing on fully decarbonizing, maybe they just get away your company car, your internal combustion car, if there is this policy that all the suppliers have to be carbon free also. Okay, I know this is a special situation in Germany, we have company cars. I'm not sure if you get one. But I think in the corporate space, there is this sweet spot where it's not only about cost, it's about image, it is about sticking to the rules and driven by the big corporations who commit to be fully decarbonized. And I think this is also a sweet spot which we should not neglect when we talk about e-mobility in Africa.
Thomas, thank you. Decarbonization undoubtedly is certainly top of the agenda. Idris, from final words from Lagos, Nigeria, your conclusion, please.
Yeah, I think the energy transition is an opportunity for us to reinvent our energy system, because we need to provide. We in Africa, we don't have access to clean energy. We don't have energy security. There are a lot of energy crises in Africa, and even the price of energy would increase in future. And we need to reinvent that system in a way that it brings everybody on board, not just few people who can just invest in the system. It brings everybody on board. Everybody becomes a participant in the energy game, and in that doing, we can build a new energy system, which is the Grid 3.0 I was talking about. That would also help increase energy access in Africa, in rural area, increase rural electrification, because once people start driving electric vehicle, rural areas are the connection between cities. We have charging stations in rural area where they can also make use of electricity that's being used maybe for charging electric vehicles. So I believe in doing this, I think we need to move in this direction to make everyone have access to energy in Africa.
Great stuff. Just thank you. Shanta, final words from yourself. You used the word ambitious at the beginning. How do we will the energy ending revolution bring rural Africa to greater accessibility to markets? Shanta, what do you think?
Well, so we definitely believe the electric revolution, the transport revolution is possible in the continent. We need to think about electric mobility as not competition to the existing transport system, because it's not. We don't have enough transport, we don't have enough logistics in this continent. It's a way to grow and complement the huge deficit we have. We need to start at the bottom. We need to stop thinking from the top down, which has been the continent's problem. So we need to start with public transport, we need to start with shared transport, we need to start with last and first mile transport. We need to make sure it benefits the majority, not the minority. And let's face it, four wheels are a luxury, and less than 5% of most people in the continent have access to a car. And maybe they aspire to a second-hand car, but essentially we know it's not going to solve the transport crisis. And finally, we have really tight deadlines to solve what looks like a pretty bad global emergency with climate change. So I'm completely frustrated that people aren't thinking bigger, thinking long term instead of quick returns, and just moving more quickly. We don't have time. And so I just think we have to shift our mindset. We need to look at, a long-term 10-year plan rather than a quick instant solution. Okay.
Shanta, thank you. That's spot on. I think just to add to your thinking, of course, Africa will have to adapt fast. I agree to this power shift, technological change is taking place. Much of which, of course, has been driven by the imperative. I think that's the key word here, imperative of climate change, as you allude to. On behalf of, thank you very much, most importantly, to the panelists for sharing your views and your time, spending your time, very much appreciated. And on behalf of the Africa Energy Indaba, thank you for participating. And for myself, Martin Davis from Deloitte, it's been a pleasure and a very productive conversation. Thank you very much, and have a good day.